For a discussion on the culture of innovation, please welcome Robert Navy Bob Ronska, Chris Vazana, and Clarence Wooten, moderated by Andrea Cates.
We may be seated.
Thank you.
This is the culture of innovation, and the conversation will be about things that we can all learn about being practical, about what is important when you're building the culture of innovation, and also some tips, what it is that we can avoid in terms of the risks. So first, I'd like to introduce Clarence Wooten, who is a Silicon Valley serial tech entrepreneur, innovation architect, and currently a senior executive at X, the Google Moonshot Factory, and author of the newly released book, which, by the way, you can get outside, hopefully a signed copy, called Co-Founder.ai. You'll hear a lot more about this book, and it's a fantastic and ultimate guide for AI-driven startup success. Next, I'd like to introduce Chris Vazana, who is a business executive who's currently serving as president of Holland LP. And Holland is a leading railroad engineering and maintenance company. He served as an executive leader for manufacturing companies serving diverse markets and fostered innovation and product vitality in each of these companies, and is also a Gold Edison Award winner. And Navy Bob Ronska is a leadership and safety expert, former fast attack submarine commanding officer, and led the US's largest submarine squadron. He carried the nuclear codes, also known as the football, and co-founded Navy Bob Consulting. He's the author of a book you can also get out in the showcase today called Beyond the Sea, Leading with Love, and a book called High Reliability Healthcare. So welcome to this amazing panel. And what we'd all like to hear first is a little bit about the why. Why are we discussing building a culture of innovation in a world that's so complex? You might think innovation is a luxury. So why is it so important? And I think I'll start with you, Clarence, since you're sitting right next to me. Why is it so important to build a culture of innovation?
Yeah, I think if you're not innovative in a corporate context specifically, you're in danger of being disrupted. I spent my entire career building startups in Silicon Valley with the goal of disruption. And so if innovation is not baked into your company's DNA, particularly when your company gets to scale, then you absolutely will be disrupted. So I think innovation is a critical part of every organization. It has to be.
Okay, I like the concept of critical part as opposed to luxury. That's a great place to get started. I'm going to go to Navy Bob next, because there couldn't be a more different set of industries that we've got sitting up here. I'd love to hear your perspective. Do you want to build on anything Clarence said, or what's your take on why it's so important?
So yes, if you look out in the showroom, I was just shocked to see a car that is hydrogen, and a plane and a pod, and somebody creating a blood to detect cancer. So Frank, what are you going to do next year? Have the hydrogen on the actual plane? So my point is this: the rate at which innovation is occurring is never as rapid as it has been before. For a guy that has carried the nuclear codes, innovation is our prosperity, it is our protection. So it is so vitally important that we have innovation for our safety and for our future.
Okay, I like this. So we're talking about safety and we're talking about future as we talk about innovation, which are not necessarily in the same thought process. So Chris, what would you like to add?
Well, I'd like to build on what was said earlier regarding the vitality of a company in a more mature environment. If you don't foster an environment where innovation is valued and segmented from your business, you become a has-been. You're either growing or you're dying. And if you aren't innovating in your space and creating a moat for your technologies, then you become commoditized. And then your gross margins start to dwindle, and you start that downward spiral, and then it becomes, how fast can you take cost out versus how fast can you innovate, continue gaining share and growing your market. So from a business perspective, I think innovation is that moat, does create that barrier to the entry versus your competition, because it is a race. And if you're innovating right, you're going to win.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of people don't think about strategy and innovation in the same room even. You know, you might have the innovators sitting in one room with a lot of sticky notes doing design thinking, and then down the hall is where all the budget decisions happen. I don't know if any of you have seen that split. Yeah, Clarence.
Well, no, I was just going to say that I think we're on the precipice of an era where innovation is going to occur at a much, much more rapid pace. Throughout history, innovation has really been about human brain power, but going forward, innovation will be about the power of AI. And we're already starting to see it. I mean, the advances in AI that have happened just in the past 3 years since the advent of generative AI have been absolutely incredible. And it's just going to make every company's pace of innovation really accelerate.
So I'd love to hear about technologies as force multipliers from anybody. Chris, Navy Bob, thoughts?
Sure, I'll take it. You know, first I'm going to talk what you initially opened with about strategy. You know, first you do a strategy plan, and in that strategy plan, you define where you've got gaps in the market, and then you apply resources around where those gaps in the market, and you focus those resources on where you're going to innovate. And this is for mature companies, not startups. And then you have to isolate those, and I would say isolate that, insulate them, these individuals, so that they aren't affected by the vagaries of the daily market, quality issues, delivery issues, customers yelling at you. But they're measured in a way where they are rewarded for seeing the long term, getting that product out to market, innovating, defining what that total applicable market is, how they can gain share, and then making sure that you budget and you create an environment where the successes of those individuals are rewarded, and that helps create that environment and that culture where you're outside of the day-to-day and you're building a strong and robust future for yourself and your company.
Well, I like what you just said, because the thought of integrating innovation into the day-to-day, it's not like, okay, we have one day off to innovate and otherwise we have to be kind of working on our ROI. But this notion of understanding the critical importance of two things you just said, Chris. One is the moat, how we really develop a distinction in the market. And the second thing you just said is interesting, because as Clarence was saying, this notion of acceleration of, whether it's AI or any other force multiplier, if you, I don't know, like catch up or give up, you can't necessarily afford to say, well, we're on our strategy, we can't afford to innovate. Navy Bob, I know you've got thoughts on this.
No, I really applaud the AI movement. That's what's going to be rapidly. But going back to the core is that you need people to innovate. And without innovation, people have to innovate the AI. And so how do you encourage innovation? Well, the formula is simple. It has to start with love. To feel cared for, to feel valued at work. When you do that, you build authentic relationships. After you build authentic relationships, you build trust. Then you build a team, effective team. That's where the communications, collaboration, and that's where innovation will occur. If you look at today, our generation, one of the statistics out there is in 2021, the Great Resignation, Great Attraction from McKinsey was the #1 reason why people were leaving their job is because they don't feel valued. And so these are the people that are going to be innovating. And if they're not innovating and they're leaving, your company is not going to sustain itself, as Chris talked about, and we're not going to innovate. So it has to start with love to be able to encourage innovation.
So I have to say, I've read your book. And it was a little bit of an oxymoron to think about a person on a Navy submarine with all of that pressure, and then the theme being, in terms of the culture, being love. I find that to be refreshing and something we'll talk about more. I'm curious, Clarence, what are some thoughts about the culture? What are the elements from your perspective of what matters from the human perspective?
Yeah, well, first off, I think, in a corporate context, innovation is not about an occasional brainstorm or setting up a flashy lab. It really comes from the top down. People need to feel safe and comfortable as it relates to their ability to take risks and experiment. One of the things that Alphabet or Google has done really, really well is we have something called 20% time that's been around since the existence of Google, where any employee inside the company can dedicate 20% of their time for an independent project. How many of you in the audience have ever used Gmail? Okay, so Gmail probably wouldn't have existed without 20% time inside of Alphabet. So, you know, you can't just walk the walk. I mean, you can't just talk the talk, you have to walk the walk when it comes to creating a culture of innovation, and that really comes from the top down, and employees need to know that you've allocated resources for them to be innovative and created that culture.
So I like what you're saying, because we think about, I don't necessarily think of the Navy as a place for innovation. It is, of course. Google, I probably think about, especially Google X, as more of a place you would expect innovation. However, what you just said is also a contrast to what I would have expected, that you have to allocate resources. It becomes kind of a fungible decision of like, where are you going to put resource A versus resource B, whether it's time or money. Chris, you're in a completely different industry. Yeah. Once again, when I heard that there was going to be a person from a railroad industry on an innovation panel, it wasn't my first thought that that would be a place for innovation, and yet the story you'll tell later is just incredible.
Yes, yes. But I'm going to build, so I will talk later on that, on some of the railroad innovations and those kind of things. But to build on the culture of innovation, you need to look at, as a leader, that innovation and entrepreneurialism is a nonlinear process. There are going to be, there's going to be successes, there's going to be failures, and that's where you build on the love and the trust that's created in an environment where you have to, in many cases, applaud and reward failures, because again, it's a nonlinear process. Not every experiment's going to go the way you want. It's an experiment. There's going to be things that happen. And as a leader, you've got to be able to have the long-term patience, both in your own humanity as well as long-term capital deployed to solve these problems. And you've got to celebrate some successes related to failures. And you have to go in with an environment of, what did we learn from this failure? How are we going to either not have it happen again, or what are we going to look at those variables that created that failure and control those variables so that you can engender success for the future? So it's part of how you create that culture, and that starts with trust, because you know that you've got to not persecute or punish a person who started an entrepreneurial or had an idea, and then it didn't come out exactly as planned on paper to the dollar budget. Oftentimes when engineers decide they're going to do an entrepreneurial project, they give you a dollar budget and a time. Me as a leader, in my head, I always double the time and double the money, because it never works on the first time.
Yeah, I would have to add to that. I mean, you definitely have to encourage failure and encourage experimentation. Mm-hmm. And I often say, build a culture that learns to fail fast and fail cheap. Mm-hmm. Because it's, you don't want any failure to kill the company, but you have to celebrate failure, and everyone should feel comfortable. And I think we tend to learn growing up that failure is bad, but in an innovation context, failure is actually how you learn. So you're not taking L's for losses, you're taking L's for learnings. And those learnings ultimately turn into successes later on, because you may try to innovate too soon, because a lot of it's about timing on a particular idea that's not quite ready. We have something at Google X called composting. So if we experiment on something that we think has the potential to be successful, and the timing just isn't right, we can't get the unit economics right to make it a profitable business line, because maybe the technology's not there or the costs aren't cheap enough, we will put that in the compost. And then later, when the time is right, it could be years later, we kind of dust it off and realize, oh, those learnings from 4 years ago now apply today, and we're able to leverage those to do something great.
So I'm going to jump into another topic. This is that one topic could probably be a Q&A in another 2 hours, because it's so important. I like what you're saying, walk the walk, because we all know what it's like to be told, please innovate, and then that person gets fired. Or please innovate, by the way, where are your quarterly earnings? And so the two-sidedness is an honest experience from a lot of us, right? That we've seen a culture of innovation happen until the pressure's on. And that's where I think what you just said sets a really good stage for what's really important, which is someone was saying, who was it, patience? Was it you, Chris?
Patient capital, yeah.
Patient capital. I mean, patient capital is a very interesting aspect to this. I like how you've set it up. So I'm going to go to sort of a quicker version of what are some times, like give us something tangible, like not necessarily your long spotlight story, because we want to make sure that we hear about all of that as well. But, you know, like, what have you seen, what's been done around you where you're like, yes, that's an example of a culture of innovation in action. Chris, I'll start with you.
Sure. I'll tell the railroad story, something that we're working on right now. You know, people take the fact that all the goods in the room, all the apparel, all those things, everything got moved, in many cases, by rail. You know, it comes into the ports, moves. A train can land from Port of Los Angeles and go to Chicago in 2 days, and it's you know 2 miles long. Another one from Port of Baltimore, and be in Chicago in 2 days. So these trains have hundreds of thousands of tons rolling at 80, 90 miles an hour, going across the United States. And one of the things that we're working on is you know, you've got to have switches so that you know they don't run into trains coming on single tracks. And we've worked on this technology, and I'm new to the company, 8 months, working on this technology to refurbish those switches. They're points, they're crossings, and you never have time to get out there and rebuild these things. And so my company has been working on this innovation for 14 years. Okay. And using robotics to come in and rebuild these switches. But now we've gone out, and it's been, I'll call it a failure because it hasn't become a mass product. Now we've gone out and got voice to the customer. We met with the CEOs of the large Class 1 railroads and said, well, why isn't this successful? And the technology, the innovation is there, but the problem statement and the voice of the customer wasn't received properly. And essentially, the innovation that needs to occur that we're working on now is how do you do it faster? How do you do it like a NASCAR F1 pit crew? How do you get in there? Because when a train goes by, another one's going to go by an hour later, and you've got to repair this on track. And so innovation can come in many forms. Innovation can be both the product, it can be the service, it can be the delivery, it can be the packaging. And so you really need to look at the innovation in many different forms and be able to realize where that nugget is that's going to enable you to succeed in the marketplace. And that's what we're doing now in our company. It's one of our breakthroughs.
So Chris, what I love about this is that once again, we hear about like the Post-it note or something that's clearly something, but what I think is so relatable is the notion that a process can be optimized in a very innovative way. Or what you just said about going out to the customer. You know, you might have the science and the engineering absolutely down pat, and then you discover you have to optimize for speed, and it's like, wait a minute, we can't just, who do we benchmark against? So an F1 pit crew sounds like a great idea. So all of that is a way of thinking about innovation. It's pragmatic, but it's also really radical. So Clarence, jump in.
Yeah, sure. I recently read a book by Silicon Valley VC, a guy by the name of Mike Maples, wrote a book called Inflections, which is pretty interesting because oftentimes innovations occur right when an inflection happens. So it could be a regulatory change that made something possible. It could be the fact that GPS is now embedded in mobile phones, and that's a great example. So think Uber. Uber couldn't have been possible until GPSs were embedded in mobile phones. That was a critical inflection that happened, and the entrepreneurs reacted to that inflection and was able to sort of create something that was unimaginable before because of a shift in technology. And so oftentimes you have to look at the greater outside market landscape for these inflections to realize and connect dots and say, now is the time that this thing can work. We can do it completely differently because of this one little invention here created an inflection. And so as a serial tech internet entrepreneur, every time I've started a company, it was because of some disruptive moment that enabled something to be possible that wasn't possible before and was able to sort of jump in early and take advantage of that. So I think it's really, really important to understand that innovation is not just about what happens within your company. It's about being observant about what's happening in the greater ecosystem around your company.
Well, I love what both of you have said. It's interesting because vantage point here we are, we have technology mindsets. It's really easy to be heads down and think that what we're working on at the bench or in our team or in our four walls is where the change is going to happen. But just that feeling of sort of looking out and saying, wait a minute, customer perspective, what to optimize for, what's happening in the market, what new technology, these moments, or like pit crews, like, wait a minute, they can do it in 7 seconds, it's taken us 2 minutes. So maybe our metric is coming from an internal focus. These are huge insights. Navy Bob, I've got to hear your thoughts about this.
So, a couple thoughts. The nuclear Navy has never had a reactor accident in 75 years. And we have 20-year-old sailors operating these highly enriched nuclear reactors. And one of the things we do in the nuclear Navy, as you talked about, when we have a problem, we celebrate it. That is a problem that we want to address so that it doesn't get bigger. Just things of failures and innovation, the same thing. This is the culture that everybody needs to state that it's okay to fail. And we're going to get to the root cause. We're not going to punish if you make a failure. We're going to celebrate it. So that is why the nuclear Navy has the safest organization that ever existed. But it goes back to culture. The culture is what is the foundation to have people voice their concerns and innovate. And so one of my stories real quick is that I was on a mission vital to national security where the President of the United States authorized this. And we're behind enemy lines on a $2 billion nuclear fast attack submarine where I was the captain. And this was no movie, this was for real. And we had 2 separate indications, independent, that they found us. And let me tell you what's at stake. If they found us, one, how much it cost to get there for national security was about $100 million, this one event. And if we failed, they would have done everything possible for us to find out, to include using force. The safety of the crew was in jeopardy. So at that point of those 2 independent indications, I assessed it to be a 99%. So I made the decision that we need to get out of there. I was a captain, and I was willing to forego the $100 million. To me, it was 100%. But my executive officer, Gary, that you can read about in the book, spoke up, and he prevented us from making that decision and saved $100 million to be able to complete that mission. We became the best submarine because of it, and it was that culture of that psychological safety, of love, trust, and psychological safety, innovation, made that come true. So that was my aha moment when I understood that culture is so important for innovation.
So I have never been in a situation with that much at stake. Honestly, I doubt that anyone in this room has. And so it raises the stakes. It really raises the stakes in terms of that human moment, because it's one thing to bring leadership when things are going well or where it's a nice to have, but when not just the dollars, but the lives, the whole, safety of nations is on the line. I can't even imagine what that's like. So I honestly would love to double down on some of your thinking here, Navy Bob. I've read your books. I've sat across from you in the showcase. I really encourage everyone to go get his book and get it signed and interact with Navy Bob. He's a force of nature. And what I'm so struck by is that, as I said, if I saw the facts lined up and said, okay, what would this guy's slogan be? I might not have come up with what your slogan ends up being. So help us through this. Tell us about Leading with Love and walk us through, this sort of story of how you landed on that.
So when I wrote this book, started 5 years ago, I didn't know.
And say the name of the book again.
It's Beyond the Sea, because this applies to everybody, not only the nuclear Navy, but it applies to everybody. And that story that I just told you, there was no other way to explain it other than love. And love is not romantic love. It's not. It is the most profound thing that we can do. And I'll give you examples. It's making your team feel valued, making them feel heard. It is not a sign of weakness. And what my story that I'll show is that our results far exceeded anything that ever imagined. So that one story was my aha moment. And that was why he spoke up, was because he had a relationship that he had my back at the cost of his own, because he knew that I had his back at the cost of my own. That relationship of building it on a foundation of love, built that trust, built that psychological safety. And this is the most important thing for any industry. If you want to innovate and be able to be successful in the future, it is your people. And that was the aha moment for me. And I went against the grain. All the leadership courses never talked about love. And love, was what I did, and that's the only way I can explain it. And if I would have followed the top-down autocratic leadership style that was taught in the military, I wouldn't be sitting here today. Because I was taught by a great leader that's in my book that taught me how to lead with love and compassion first. And Mr. Rogers has this famous quote or saying, love and success, it has to be in that order. It's that simple and that difficult. When you put love first, success will far exceed any expectations you'll ever imagine. But when you only put productivity first and your greatest engine is your people, you're going to be stuck and you're going to not innovate.
That's a really easy story to follow. So Clarence,
I'm so glad I'm not following.
Yeah, no.
It's up to you.
So I've also read Clarence's book, Co-founder.ai. It came out, 20 hours ago?
Pretty much.
Yeah, and I happened to read it, luckily. It's a really great book for two reasons. One is it actually strikes that notion of what you just said, the inflection point. I mean, here we are, AI, 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 AI. If you haven't heard of AI, you've been sleeping in a cave. However, the way that you frame AI as an enabler of so much in terms of powerful business possibilities is unprecedented. And I'll say the second thing, which is Co-founder.ai is a book that's so small looking that he's sitting next to me in the showcase, and I looked at the book. It's very small because it's full of next gen, right? It's full of QR codes that actually enable us to have interactive AI experiences with the entire process. So you've got to see the book and get it signed by Clarence. So tell us about Co-founder.ai.
Yeah, well, first off, thank you very much. So as I mentioned before, inflections are important. And for me, an inflection happened in November of 2022, and that was the ChatGPT moment. And after having spent my entire career, 30 years before even arriving at Google as a serial entrepreneur, I had to learn to bootstrap. Because when you're an entrepreneur, you have limited resources. You have limited human capital and you have limited capital. And so you're always looking for ways to do more with less. And for a very long time, the ultimate form of leverage has been venture capital. But when I had an opportunity to interact with ChatGPT and then later Alphabet's Gemini, which came out pretty quickly thereafterwards, or we were calling it Bard at first, it was really, really clear to me that it was a game changer and really the ultimate force multiplier for a startup entrepreneur with limited resources. And so, having been an entrepreneur for years and built a couple of companies, I had often thought about writing a book on my process of building startups. However, I didn't want to do another Me Too book. You had the Lean Startup and other books in that space. But when generative AI exploded onto the scene, it was really, really clear that if you overlay AI on top of the startup building process, you can do 10 times more with 10 times less. And leapfrog the need for the earliest rounds of venture capital such that you don't have to chase VCs. You can ultimately build a product, get the product market fit, start building quicker for far less expense, and ultimately wait for VCs to chase you. And so that was the premise behind the book Co-founder.ai. Now, we all know how rapidly AI is changing. Every week, there seems like there's a new model. Then you find out about DeepSeek and you name it. And so the reason the book is only 148 pages is because the book is about the startup building process and some of the workflows associated with conceptualizing, launching, iterating, scaling, and also exiting your business. But the workflows and the AI associated with those occur online at cofounder.ai, which is ultimately an online platform where you can leverage those workflows to execute each of those 5 phases. And so, yes, so the book on some levels is lead gen for the platform because it takes both. And I actually think from an innovation perspective, I think most how-to books in the future will function this way.
Well, one of the things that is great about not just the book and the platform, but the mindset is that a lot of people are trying to get their foot in the door or start to learn about how AI might be relevant. But what I love about what you're doing is it's empowering so many entrepreneurs and scale-ups and large corporations trying to innovate with tools that will actually teach them it's like learning by doing as opposed to learning by reading. And I think it's a wonderful way to equip everyone in the community here with the tools we need to be in this dynamic flow.
Speaking of books, you have one as well.
I do, but that's not for today's panel, but thank you. but it is next to yours, and people can come meet me, thank you. So Chris, I have an interesting observation about, from our little conversation to get ready for this, which is that what Navy Bob and Clarence were just talking about, if I think about it in one way, it's actually process. And when we were chatting a bit, and we think about railroads and F1 and the mindset and what you optimize for in most businesses, we're not all going to be people that invent Post-it notes, right. Nor should we be. We need to innovate by integrating it into our management, our leadership, our day-to-day. It has to be part of our daily habits. So from your perspective, where have you seen a spotlight story that's really memorable?
Okay, so well, first off, 3 out of 4 panelists have books. 25% do not, and so I'm at a disadvantage here. So make sure.
Wait! You're actually on the cutting edge because Clarence is explaining we just need QR codes.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah, we don't need books now.
I need to put some on my tie or tonight.
Yeah, exactly.
But so I want to build on 2 things. I don't have a great story to have a book. I've been a turnaround specialist. I'm a corporate guy. I've turned around, and I'm involved in my 5th business, turning it around. More related to taking existing businesses and engendering innovation culture. But one of the things about the process of innovation, and one of the tools that I like to use, and I hope that those that are in established businesses use this, is a vitality index. And when you go in and you look at your strategy and where your total applicable markets and where you're going to innovate, you want, in those defined markets, you want to establish key metrics that measures whether you're winning or losing in innovation. And that's taking a qualitative metric and turning it into a quantitative metric that you can celebrate and you can reward people on. And vitality index essentially says of my total products that I sell, my total revenue for a given segment, divide that, it sounds like you know this, I see some nodding over here, you divide that by, and your denominator is, and your numerator is the new products launched within a certain defined time frame. So if it's in a fast market, like cell phones, it might be 2 years or 1.5 years. If it's in a long market, like construction or ag or railroads, where it's 5 years to get out there and accepted, you then divide that by the total revenue. And so your percentage of how new are your products and whether you're driving that culture to have newness and increasing the vitality of your business is something that creates a culture where you're trying to motivate people to be innovative. And in a mature business, it's hard to do that because it's easy to stay in stasis. So a lot of people that just want to do their thing and work every day. But creating an environment of innovation is about measuring that innovation and rewarding success related to that innovation. That again, that helps build that moat. So
Vitality Index, QR code, vitalityindex.ai.
I got to write a book.
There you go. Or don't bother.
Don't forget to throw love in there too.
What is that? Love?
Don't forget to throw love in.
And a new football.
Yeah,
right.
I think we've got a whole new QR code coming. Mm-hmm. So this is the time for us to allow, speaking of technology, the audience to give us a word that's been resonating. Now, it's a Slido, so if you have the QR code, please give us your word. The question is, which keyword about leadership so far resonates with you from today's panel? Now, I need to express that this is kind of like The Voice, where these guys' feelings will be hurt if their word is not the one that's chosen. So I'm just letting you know that that could happen. But we would love to take a pulse. So I'm going to go on to the next part of the conversation, but just think of one word or phrase that is resonating, with you so far about leadership in terms of a culture of innovation. And we'll let that kind of play. Is everybody good with the QR code? Should also be on your table. And before we see the results of your inputs, which we will see in just a few minutes, love is coming up first. This is Navy Bob. Oh no, this is terrible. Love, more love. Love is still center.
I don't think any of us can be mad at that.
No.
Yeah.
All right. Love, okay, so it's interesting. Culture, support, empathy, fail fast, experiment, leadership success. There's a lot of love going on here. Vitality. There you go, Chris, you got a point. Yeah, no
Small,
VC. Hashtag
on the
no
book.
VC. I love that. Learning from failure, diplomacy, celebrating failures, culture, learning. Love is not, you're going to sell a lot of books, Bob.
No.
Yeah. This is fantastic. Okay, compassion, failure, empathy, walk the walk. There you go, Clarence. Fail cheap, strategy, celebrate, 20%. Let's keep that going for a little bit. I'm going to ask another.
Wait a minute,
This is great.
love is shrinking. What's happening here?
Love is shrinking. Oh no. I think I shamed people into not putting love. Okay.
Yeah,
So
fail fast too.
fail fast. Yeah, this is
right.
actually, we're getting some equality going here. Celebrate failure, fail cheap. Okay, we'll let that keep going. Cofounder.ai. There you go. All right, we made our points. This is great to see what the audience is resonating with. So I have one last quick question, which is, how do we know it? This is like literally lightning round. Like, how do we know it's working? One quick phrase. So Chris, how do we know that you've got a culture of innovation? What's one thing that you look for? Quick.
When people fail at doing an innovation or there's a not immediate success, they're not worried about their job the next day.
Love it. Clarence?
I was just going to say fail fast and fail cheap and keep it theme.
Just read the board.
The company didn't die, but we learned some things.
There you go. Okay, Navy Bob?
So it's like beauty. It's hard to express or define, but when you know it, you know it. That's culture. And you hit that inflection point where people are no longer fearful of making a mistake to get in trouble. They're fearful of making a mistake to disappoint others. That's when you know that you have that magical culture.
Okay, one more thing for the audience, which is any questions you have. We're going to have time for 1 or 2 or 3 questions. So please, same thing, you should be able to use the QR code now and put a question in while we keep talking. So, okay, here's the thing that I find really important. There's a risk of not innovating. And Chris, you started it with this notion of status quo. If you don't build a moat, well, you don't build a moat with yesterday's behaviors. You have to be able to really understand that there's a downside to status quo. So what are the risks? I'll start with you, Chris. What are the risks of not innovating?
Margin degradation and being commoditized in the marketplace. And it becomes a race to the bottom and who can produce the product or service the cheapest. Innovation provides for accelerating price, margins, profitability, which creates that flywheel of reinvestment in R&D, reinvestment in innovation. If you lack that, you get in a downward spiral.
And a little follow-up, which is, what should you avoid? In other words, we're all leaders. We walk into a room and we want to do this, but our training might have been telling us to act a different way. What's something we should completely take off of our leadership agenda for our behavior? Clarence, you have something?
Well, I was still thinking about the last question, but I was thinking, the risk of not innovating is, of course, I think as companies get bigger and more successful, innovation becomes harder. And it's a reason why large companies will acquire smaller startups, because as your culture becomes bigger and you have that cash cow, everyone lives and focuses on that cash cow until that cash cow is no longer around. A great example is CPUs versus GPUs, and I think it's relevant for obvious reasons, which I'm sure you guys know about. Intel versus NVIDIA, right? Intel was on top of the world 20 years ago with CPUs, but the world evolved towards GPUs. Intel didn't move quite as fast. And so now NVIDIA is dominating. And so I think it's really, really important, even once you've scaled and become a very large enterprise and you have the successful cash cow, to not lose sight of what's happening in the external market, and don't wait until it's too late. Another great example is I have a friend who was an executive at Blockbuster once upon a time. And she advised the CEO at the time that they should buy this little company called Netflix. And at the time, they could have bought Netflix for $100 million. And the CEO laughed at her. We all know how that story ended up. And so, innovation is really, really critical. And the bigger your company gets, you need to be more and more fearful.
Well, I have one different question for Navy Bob, which is, and I'm thinking, is it called Crew Top 3? Okay. In your book, you talk about, well, you tell the story.
So I took the worst submarine when I first started out. If that story that I told you earlier happened when I first took command, we would have failed. I took one of the worst submarines, lowest morale, lowest attrition, highest turnover, almost failed major inspections. It was like whack-a-mole. Instead of continuing in that autocratic leadership and holding people accountable, I looked myself in the mirror and I said, what am I doing to make this culture? What resources, what am I doing? So I did something completely different of not what was expected. I just asked the crew, what are their top 3 concerns? And the things that I found were just profound. And what it did, it made them feel valued, it provided transparency, and it provided that mental analysis to go through. So that aha moment for me with the crew top 3 was the spark that changed the culture of where it was today. At the end, we had the #1 ship out of 10, which is objectively measured. We had the highest retention, lowest turnover in the Pacific Fleet for 2 consecutive years, and we scored the highest possible grade. And I attribute that spark to happen with the crew top 3. And I know we have to go, but this is also really important. I am very humble when you read my book. Shouldn't be on the stage with these people. And the purpose of life, as Mr. Rogers has said this, is that God has put us on this earth for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to serve others. It's not about how much money you make. Sure, money is the fuel for your purpose, but through innovation, this is the measure of success. And success is what is the most important thing. And how we make a difference in this world is through innovation. And how do you get the highest probability of innovation? It's through people and getting a culture of caring and love first.
Great. So Chris, a lot of questions from the audience. I'm going to give you your last, and then we'll end with Clarence. But your final thoughts. It could be something that we've heard from the audience. There are questions about what to tell the younger generation. There are questions about optimism and hope in this time and how innovation can help. There are questions about which industry is at most risk. But I would love for you to synthesize anything you heard from the conversation or from the questions.
Yeah, I'm going to build a little bit on what both of these guys had mentioned. He's about layering technologies and innovation and how one thing allows to another. And you're building on trust and all the foundational elements that are around trust. In the younger generation, if you go back, 20, 30 years, industries used to be very hierarchical. The CEO or the president knew all the answers, and everyone else just followed. And I think that what's happening in the world is the most positive, the most inspiring cultures are those that allow for pushback, allow for and celebrate pushback, and create. I read the first chapter of your book last night, where your executive officer felt comfortable pushing back. You need to create a culture where you invite that pushback. And you tell the younger generation, speak up if something doesn't look right. Because the further you're up at the top as a CEO, the less connected you are to what's happening at the ground. And you really need to depend on those folks that are right there. The Japanese say, go to Gemba, go to where the action is. And you need to be able to hear the voices of those that are at where the action is and create a culture where they can push back up at the CEO, because then you create a culture where where trust is built, you get this flywheel of success, and you're not always the person that's right. And so I would say to the younger generation, use your voice, build a relationship, network, so that you aren't just coming out of the blue and talking. That relationship you talked about came from months and months of trust building. And that really needs to occur. And so that would be the message I would say to the younger generation.
Clarence, you get to close us out.
Well, it looks like I have 4 seconds.
You have 4 seconds.
So
just
I'm
be
just going to say,
profound in
look,
4 seconds.
learn from your customers. At the end of the day, if you want to be a culture of innovation, your customers will tell you where you need to innovate. So always listen to customers at the end of the day.
So I'd like to thank Clarence and Chris and Navy Bob. It's a fabulous way to start this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.